For the last few months, we've been doing a series on the war on drugs, and I thought I'd just share some of the things that we've learnt through the process of the war on drugs. You know, it really goes back to the beginning of the 20th century. There was sort of a Christian-led movement, particularly in the United States, against alcohol. This is probably good intentions. Men were drinking a lot, not being very nice to their wives, missing days on work. People were poor, and it was having a big impact on people's lives. And so there was this movement that was started, a group of people around the country that was pushing for prohibition, which of course they achieved. They had an amendment to the Constitution that outlawed alcohol, circa 1920. What happened then is the mob obviously moved in and started supplying the booze that people wanted to drink, and the government retaliated. They tried to crack down on the mob. The mob was making a lot of money. They fought amongst themselves, caused a lot of violence. The government started putting poison into the alcohol, and that the mob was stealing and then refurbishing for the people to drink. Made a lot of people sick, a lot of people died because the government was putting poison in the alcohol that they knew people were going to drink as a way of trying to stop them from drinking. Anyway, this government infrastructure built up around trying to stop people from drinking, policing prohibition, as it were. In the early 30s, the US is in the Great Depression. Franklin Delano Roosevelt becomes president, and he liked to drink, and he also thought the government needed the tax revenue from the alcohol. So they repealed that amendment and re-legalized alcohol. But now you have this infrastructure of people inside the government who don't have a job. So what are they going to do? So they started looking for something else that they could police. Now, up until that point in time, in the early part of the 20th century, late 19th century, most of the drugs that we consider illegal today, cocaine, heroin, opium, were around and they were available. You could go and buy them from a pharmacy, from a chemist, and they were in cough medicines and medicines for babies and for women suffering from PMT and all sorts of things. Well, the government started to crack down on those slowly, and with some good reason. People were taking these medicines and taking a lot of them and starting to have some health issues. So the government initially started to regulate those ingredients and make sure that there was truth in labeling, and then they started to tax them. But then in the early 1930s, a guy by the name of Harry Anslinger, who was the head of the department inside the United States Treasury that had been enforcing the alcohol prohibition, decides that he's going to make a big stick out of marijuana usage. And it was largely because of racist reasons. The main people that were consuming marijuana in the United States at the time were Mexicans coming over the border and African Americans. A lot of blues and jazz musicians and singers. And Harry didn't like jazz. He didn't like the blues. He didn't like African Americans. He didn't like Mexicans. And so they really went after the drug marijuana, as a way of maintaining and building his private fiefdom inside of Treasury. The scarier you can make marijuana sound, the easier it is for you to get a bigger budget to go and police both the dealers and the users of marijuana. And B, it was also a way of cracking down on African Americans and Mexicans. Now, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, there was a lot of white people in the United States that were worried about African Americans and Mexicans coming to the country and being able to vote. A bit like there is today, this fear that the minorities are coming and they're going to change our way of life. And a lot of the states in the US at the time had, particularly in the South, had passed legislation that would disenfranchise minorities, or anyone really that had been arrested that was a felon. And an easy way to make a big chunk of the African American and Mexican population, Latino populations, felons at the time, was to make illegal something that had previously been legal that they liked to do, which was smoke marijuana. Now, opium was also in there, which was mostly Chinese immigrants who were working particularly on the West Coast. So there was a big racist element in the war on drugs from the very beginning. Now, when we started this series, I thought that the authorities, the governments, the legislators, etc., must have thought during the 20th century that drugs like marijuana were in fact bad for you. But that in fact isn't the case. As we dug into the archives, we found that study after study tried to tell the governments, not just of the United States, but all around the world, that these things aren't really bad for you. There's a small minority of people that become addicts, that have a bad reaction and might massively increase their anxiety or their paranoia. But for 99% of people, they can use marijuana or cocaine or heroin and go about their lives, go to work, look after their families. They use it in the same way that most people use alcohol or tobacco. And in fact, they're even less damaging than alcohol and tobacco, which of course were in the 30s, were both legal. There were massive studies, and a lot of the studies over the next 40 odd years were actually commissioned by politicians. They would say, okay, well, let's get together a panel of experts and we'll study this issue and come to the right conclusion. And their commission would go away for a year or two and would look at all of the latest scientific research, and then they would present their findings and say, listen, marijuana is really not a problem. It's really not bad for you. It's not a gateway drug. It doesn't lead to crime. And governments every time would take that study, throw it in the shredder, fire that commission, and say, well, we're just going to keep doing what we're doing. Why? Again, as far as I can trace it, there's three main drivers for the war on drugs in the 20th century. One was building up of this administrative infrastructure, government infrastructure, policing infrastructure, and just the people whose job it was to track down these things. Organisations like the DEA and at a state level police, both federal and state, huge budgets were pulled together which paid salaries for thousands and tens of thousands of government officials. And once you've built that up, you don't want to let it go. What are you going to do with all of those people? So that was part of it. Another part of it was definitely racism, and it was a way of disenfranchising big chunks of the non-white population of the United States to prevent them from being able to vote or to mobilize. Particularly we saw in the Nixon era and LBJ's era, during sort of the height of the Vietnam protests, these laws were also used to try and disenfranchise and break the back of the anti-war protest movement, because a lot of those people smoked marijuana. Good way of preventing massive protests was to arrest all of the protesters on the issue of drugs. And then the third element of this is about economics. There is a lot of money to be made in supplying the industry that's clamping down on things like the war on drugs. There are a lot of businesses across the United States that would profit from these sorts of wars that go on. Not just the people that make the weapons for the military or the planes that fly overhead and try and track down marijuana plantations, but a lot of smaller businesses that you may not think of as well. If you have tens of thousands of people inside of a government infrastructure that only exist to try and keep track of the war on drugs, and you have the prison system, of course, the for-profit prison system that's part of that. But you also have people that are supplying these tens of thousands of government employees with computers and software and pens and pencils. They have a vested interest in those government agencies continuing to exist because they make a lot of money out of it. It's a bit like war in general. On our Cold War series, we did 3 episodes early on the economics of war. I think it's one thing that we often miss, and it doesn't get talked a lot about in the media, is war is a big industry, of course, we know that, but it's not just the people who make the guns and the bullets and the planes and the tanks and the missiles that make money. There are tens of thousands of businesses across the United States that make a lot of money out of war because they're providing all of this other stuff that the Pentagon needs to run a war and to fund the bases that they build in countries after a war. And there's billions of dollars that go to businesses making uniforms and soft drink and food and all the computer stuff, iPhones, that have to go to keep these bases running. Billions of dollars that's revenue for tens of thousands of American businesses that come to rely on it. It could be 5 or 10% of their annual budget that they're expecting to get from the Pentagon. So of course they're going to be talking, the owners of these businesses are going to be talking to their local senators and congress people and saying, hey, you know, make sure that money keeps coming in, which means we have to go to war. If you want me to keep taking some of that money and putting it towards your election campaigns, you need to keep the money coming in to me so I can send some of it back to you. So a lot of that's happened in the war on drugs as well. And I think the last thing, which is quite evident, particularly we see this from the 70s onwards, Nixon's era onwards, through Reagan, is this idea that it's not society's fault that people are using drugs. I mean, there is a school of thought today, and always has been, that people who want to get high, like people that want to drink, they're trying to find some solace from the difficulties of life, economic difficulties, societal difficulties, just dealing with the pressures of society in the workplace and in the family, and financial pressures and all these sorts of things. Much more pertinent, I guess, if you grow up in a low socioeconomic family and you don't have health care, and your parents are working 2 or 3 jobs just to keep food on the table, and maybe one or both of your parents has served some time in prison and you're just trying to cope. So people use drugs as a way of, I guess, just dealing with the difficulties of life. But successive governments in the United States don't like to treat drug addicts as a medical problem or as a societal problem. They like to treat it as a moral issue. These people are bad people. Bad people do drugs. Not sick people, not people that are struggling and need help, not people that are sick and need health care, because that would encourage people to think differently about drug users and drug addicts. So they prefer to spend billions and billions of dollars treating drug users and drug addicts as bad people as opposed to sick people, and treating the providers of the drugs as bad people rather than just business people that are trying to meet a need. So that's 30 episodes of our War on Drugs series. So far we've done 30 hours on this. There's probably a few more hours left to go. But that's kind of our findings encapsulated into a few minutes. If you want to hear the full series, go to thebsfilter.com.